Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and today's contract tip has to do with difference of opinion between a buyer and a seller when terminating a contract. Dana, what are you talking about? So let's say you have a buyer and a seller and they are under contract, and for whatever reason, one of the parties terminates the contract. Typically, it's going to be the buyer, and let's say the buyer terminates the contract. Well, let's say the buyer sends over the termination and release agreement to the seller, and in that, they're going to terminate the contract. In the GAR purchase and sale agreement, the termination, notice of termination, and the agreement to disperse the earnest money are all contained on one document. In the RE forms, the termination notice is one document, and the agreement to disperse the trust funds is a separate document. They're two separate issues. GAR addresses them on one form. So let's say a buyer terminates contract and sends over the note, the TNR, termination and release, and so they've terminated, and then under the agreement to disperse the earnest money, they put that they're getting the earnest money back. Well, we know that the notice to terminate is unilateral and only requires one party's signatures. However, the agreement to disperse the earnest money does need agreement. Hence, it needs both parties' signatures. So let's say the seller doesn't agree to disperse the earnest money to the buyer. So then the seller pulls out their own TNR and they send over a termination notice, and they send over the disbursement of the earnest money to them, to the seller, or somehow different from the one the buyer sent. Well, you turn all this into your compliance broker, and we have a mess. We now have two termination and release agreements. One typically shows on paper that it was initiated by the buyer, and the other one that was initiated by the seller. And what's happening is that the difference or the discrepancy has to do with what happens to the earnest money. So generally speaking, if you have a buyer and a seller that don't agree, then it is going to, if the broker is holding the earnest money, the broker typically is going to do the 10-day letter or go through and make an interpretation of the contract, figure out what happened, which party terminated. Did they terminate by an unexpired agreed upon contingency? Did they terminate by default? So forth and so on. Remember, if you're binding under the GAR contract and it's an all-cash deal, and the closing attorney is holding the earnest money, it must go to court. It must be an interpleader action into court per the GAR contract. And this is in 2022. We'll wait and see what happens in 2023 if GAR changes that. But right now in 2022, that's what happens in an all-cash deal with the closing attorney holding the earnest money. But back to the issue at hand. So what happens? Well, as a broker looking through trying to figure out what happened, there is going to be a delay because who terminated the contract? Did the buyer terminate the contract, or did the seller terminate the contract? And when? We have two TNRs. And it definitely, obviously, well, hopefully, not necessarily obviously, but hopefully the broker is going to go through the process of talking to the agents, finding out what happened, requesting copies of emails when the actual termination notice was sent to the other party, so we can check terms of notice and when the document was sent, not just signed. But it absolutely is going to cause a delay and perhaps some confusion regarding who terminated when. Did the seller terminate? Did the seller terminate by default, or did the buyer terminate? Did the buyer terminate by default or by an agreed upon unexpired contingency? So my point is, you as the agent, the buyer's agent and the seller's agent, if there is going to be a termination, if the buyer, I don't think you're probably going to talk about it before you terminate. Well, you could to save the deal, but let's say the buyer sends over termination and the seller does not agree to the disbursement of the earnest money. Listing agents is probably best to strike through that and send that back. And I'm really not a proponent of striking through and initialing. But if you do initiate a new TNR, it gets confusing. So I guess if you receive a termination notice, and there is an issue or a difference of opinion regarding who gets the earnest money, this is the time for you as the agents to pick up the phone and talk to one another and try and figure it out, to get on the same page to avoid any delays in the appropriate disbursement of the earnest money per a terminated contract. Thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. Bye. If you like that video, check out the one here. If you like the content on this entire channel, please click here to subscribe. I try to take even the most complicated of real estate situations and make them crystal clear. See what I did there? Real estate made crystal clear. Thank you guys so much for watching.